Hello. All right, let me just plug this in. This worked during the tech test, so it should be okay. And play. My name is Ragnar. This is my first time at AdventureX. I'm very excited. How many people here are game developers? Oh, okay. And how many are adventure game developers? Okay, so most. It's a pretty much 100% crossover. That's cool. Yeah, I'm a developer myself. Been working with games for a very long time. I've heard that people here grew up playing my games, which is frightening and humbling. I was also told that I look much younger than I really had any right to, so that's good. I'll start with a preamble, which I've written in my notes as a pre-ramble, and that's pretty much the level of comedy you're going to get here, unfortunately. A lot of people have asked me what my talk is about because it doesn't have a title, and my answer has been, I don't know. I'm sure I'll figure it out by the time I start speaking, and here we are. I spent a lot of time the last few weeks thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and I'm sure a lot of you are here because I worked on The Longest Journey and Dreamfall Chapters, and you want to hear me talk about those games? I will a bit. Looking far back can get a bit sort of navel-gazing, and it's also kind of, I don't know, it's narcissistic to keep talking about something you did 20 years ago. It can also be a bit frustrating, and that sounds arrogant, but I tend to want to look ahead, and being defined by who or what you were and what you did 10, 15, 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, that can be a bit tough. I'm grateful to be able to be invited to a conference like this without even submitting a title. And I'm grateful for the past. I try not to be anchored by it. I do want to look ahead. I do also find it a bit hard to talk about what I worked on and talk about the past, even as I'm influenced, of course, by it and guided by it. And I'm sure I'm not, alone in this, is in not being happy with what I've done in the past. Looking at the work I've done, sitting down to play the games I worked on, it's just deeply embarrassing. The things I wrote 20 years ago, it makes me cringe sometimes. I can see the good bits. And they're often the bits I didn't really have anything to do with. But the bad stuff always sort of floats to the surface. So instead of doing that, talking about what I did a long time ago, I figured I might talk about failure and how we don't talk about failure in the game industry. But at the end of the day, it didn't feel like the right place to do that. This isn't GDC. I will submit that talk to GDC at some point. I think talking about failure is important, and I actually will a bit too, because failure represents the reality of creative endeavors, especially in the game industry. But after thinking about these things, about what I was going to talk about in a talk that's just labeled From the Creator of The Longest Journey, it sort of made sense to me what I was going to talk about. Being defined by the past, knowing and understanding failure, wanting to look ahead to the future. Well, to me, that's adventure games. It's a lot of what my experience of adventure games has been, and what they are, and what some people consider, adventure games in general, or being defined by the past, being not important anymore, and they're completely wrong. This is the genre I love. It's often wrongly seen as a bit of a relic, as past its prime by people who don't know what they're talking about. The thing is, adventure games won. The pillars of adventure gaming took over gaming in general without getting any of the credit. And now what do we do with that? So I guess that's what my talk is about, at least partly. But it's not just adventure games that won, though, and this is important. You see what I mean about the pre-ramble? It's almost over. I will get to the presentation. But this is important to me, the narrative one, right? And adventure games versus narrative games, what is the definition there? I'm not going to get into that because that's smarter people than me should be doing that, and that's not what this is about. But the narrative won. A narrative always wins, which is both good and bad. Because we're in a world now where narrative trumps facts and observable science. Story has become truth and not just emotional truth, which is what storytelling should be about. Those in power shape the narratives. And the best or the most ruthless storytellers shape the world around them. So that's a power we have, but it's also power that other people have that shouldn't have that power. Story is a powerful tool. It can be a weapon, it can be a snake oil or a placebo, telling us what we want to hear and giving false comfort. But it can also be a remedy or a tonic. And for the past 2.5 years, yeah, pretty much exactly 2.5 years, I've been constantly asking myself, what can I do? What can we do? How can we as an indie studio help? How can we be socially conscious while still creating entertainment? And I don't want to create just escapism. I mean, having a place to go when the world is the way it is right now is important. But we have enough avenues of escape. I want the stories that I tell and that we tell at Red Thread Games, which is where I work, to be important, to mean something, to say something, to be about something, to have some sort of impact emotionally, socially, politically. I'm not here to talk about politics. I mean, I could, and it wouldn't embarrass me to do so, and I think that's important, but that's not what this talk is about. But politics is a part of what we do as storytellers, what I do as a storyteller. With Dreamfall Chapters, we were told off by players for putting politics in their stories, and some players weren't happy about that. The next game we're doing, which I'm not talking about today, is a deeply political game. It's an angry game, because for the last few years I've been waking up every morning and reading the news, and I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm depressed. And channeling that into creative endeavors, into the work I do, is the only thing I feel I can do. And maybe next year, if I'm invited back, I'll give a talk about that and how, in the context of storytelling and adventure games, we can push back, we can use stories to shape the way people think and feel and to help, but not today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the past and the present and the immediate future. There's politics in that, but hopefully a little bit more subtle. So, the pre-ramble is almost over. I woke up this morning and the weather was beautiful, and I didn't read Twitter or Washington Post or The Guardian or anything, and I was happy. I had a nice breakfast. And then I decided I was going to change my talk, because that's the advantage of not having submitted a summary or a title. I can just do that. Nothing holds me back. So I'm going to talk about why I'm here and how I ended up here, not just on this stage, but where I am in life. I'll talk about what I've done and that the people I work together, what we've done, and what we're currently doing, and what I'd like others to do. And maybe that's some of you guys, because as we just learned, there are a lot of adventure game developers in this room. So great. And maybe I can influence or inspire one or two of you. And of course, everything I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about in the context of adventure games. And I choose to call it that, not just narrative games, but adventure games. And I'll get around to explaining the difference, or at least my definition of it. Games to me is a storytelling device, first and foremost, and the best storytelling device. And, I'm a writer, not a speaker, so take that into consideration. I'm happiest when I'm sitting in front of a screen listening to ambient electronica and writing words, not standing on a stage in front of an audience. But hopefully I can tell you guys a bit of a story today, and hopefully that serves as a bit of inspiration. I'm also going to be talking very shortly, because I'm running out of time already, about, that's a very long preamble, about the game that we're working on right now at Red Thread Games called Draugen, which is an adventure game. It might not be an adventure game as most people define it, but it is. We're super busy with that, and we are close to revealing our new trailer, and I'm going to be showing you guys that today. It's the world premiere. First time we show it in front of an audience. It was finished yesterday, so... And half an hour before I had to leave for my plane, I couldn't get it to transfer to the iPad, so, you know, it's... Let's start with the past. So, 15, 14 years ago, I said this. So, to be fair, the full quote was, "Classic point-and-click adventure games are dead," but that still doesn't sound very good, especially considering the first talk of today. And I was wrong. Thank God for that. It was also something I was told to say by marketing, the company I worked at, because this was in relation to the first Dreamfall game, Dreamfall: Longest Journey, which came out in 2006. We were not allowed to call it an adventure game because that was supposed to be a death knell for the game. So we sort of coined the phrase modern adventure, which was, I was supposed to take credit for that. I also might have done that, but I definitely wasn't the first to call it that. And anyway, I was wrong. So now, today, you can quote me on this, adventure games are not dead. They're massive, bigger than ever. They're never, ever going away. Hopefully can win some points with you guys, but I believe in this. I think it's the truth. So a few things about myself. So I used to work for Funcom, developer in Norway, for a very long time. I've made a few games there. I'm currently creative director and co-founder of Red Thread Games, where I write, design, I direct, I get groceries and toilet paper. I make sure people get paid every month. I do a lot of different things, except actually sit down and make games. I just, you know, write the things. And I've been fighting for survival in this game industry for 25 years, which is, as a developer, that's mostly what most of us do, right? And that's a whole other talk. I'd love to talk about that, GDC. Before I made games, I used to fish for some reason. I can't even understand why, but that's something I used to do. My first adventure game was made with something called the Quill, which was a text adventure tool for Commodore 64. I made a game called Peasant's Quest, also made Peasant's Quest 2. Sort of Terry Pratchett meets Zork. I made like 100 games while I was in my early teens, and then I went off to film school because that's what I wanted to do. Didn't want to work in games. I wanted to tell stories to, you know, visually to large audiences. Well, I bought these games. I think that was in 1993. And these were the boxes they came in, at least in the US where I lived at the time. So both of these games were early CD-ROM graphical adventures. And they were eye-opening to me. As in, you know, these were games that used speech, beautiful music, beautiful visuals, and were able to tell very different stories, but great stories in new ways. And at that point, I figured, like, film, like, why would I want to do that when I can tell even cooler stories in an interactive medium? So I joined Funcom. Yeah. It was the 90s. We all looked like that. This was actually at Walt Disney. So this was a week after I started at Funcom, I think. I was sent off to Hollywood to first meet the director of Casper the Friendly Ghost movie. I made the game for that movie. It's not a great game. Or a great movie. But that was basically me bringing adventure games, at least adventure game design, to a non-adventure genre, if that makes sense. So that game was more sort of a action puzzle adventure thing, where you floated as Casper around a big mansion and you couldn't pass through walls because we couldn't find a good design solution to passing through walls. He was a solid ghost. And he liked broccoli. It was my first game. But the game included puzzles, it included descriptions of things. I tried to, because I wanted to make adventure games, I wanted to do. I basically just got the job and I had to make this game, but I tried to put as much adventure into it as possible. And after that, I wrote The Longest Journey, and we spent 3 years making that game. And that turned out pretty okay. I worked on the story for a game called Anarchy Online, which is a massively multiplayer online game. It's still operating, actually. I also wrote a novel with the backstory to that game, because I wrote so much backstory and so little of it was usable in the game that I figured might as well write a book, so I did. And then Dreamfall, the sequel to Longest Journey, was the modern adventure that continued the story from The Longest Journey, but it did so in a way that disappointed a lot of people from The Longest Journey. But the funny thing is that there are two sort of divergent fan bases here. There's the original Longest Journey players and the original Dreamfall players who started with that game. So it's really funny how this series has sort of two different fan bases, and there's some crossover. But it's really interesting to me see whichever game you started with is usually the game that people love the most. Then I worked on The Secret World for 6 years. Secret World is another massively multiplayer online game that is basically like a super expensive adventure game with fighting. We got to do whatever we wanted to do with that game, and there are puzzles, there are stories, there are characters you can talk to. There's so many adventure game design ideas in that game, married together with RPG action. Emulation, evolution, revolution. I'll get back to that a little bit, but one thing that's important to me is this is how I see being a creative person, how you evolve. You start with emulation, and just going back here a little bit, what I did with The Longest Journey was emulate what I loved and what I knew, telling a story that I hope was fresh and different, but mechanically it was really inspired by the games I loved. The Dreamfall was an evolution of that, and it was successful in some ways and not so much in other ways. And the third step on that sort of, creative ladder is revolution, actually doing something completely new with what you learn from emulating and evolving. I'll get back to that a little bit. After Secret World, started Red Thread Games, and our our mission is to make games with soul for players who love stories. We experiment with new ways to design interactive narratives, and we make adventure games that will be sometimes, or have been, or will continue to be narrowly defined as not adventure games by gatekeepers, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. Are you guys keeping tabs on all the things I'm going to talk about later? Because we don't have that much time, right? I'll show you guys a trailer from Dreamfall Chapters, even though I think most of you probably are familiar with it, but I'll run it anyway. So this is the trailer to what we call the Final Cut, which was basically a collection of all the 5 episodes remastered and with some new bits and some bits removed, mostly removed actually, which we released in the summer of 2017. All right. So Dreamfall Chapters was our attempt at a revolution. It was an ambitious experiment. It was super expensive. It's difficult to make for a tiny studio like ours. Most of that game was made by 10 people. It was over-ambitious. I do not think we succeeded at the revolution in any way. We did some evolution. We evolved some of the mechanics that we've sort of tried before. But it was a game that was hard to get into for anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with the series. It was a game that was sort of hamstrung by its episodic structure and lots of time between episodes. But it's a game we're extremely proud of having been able to make as a small indie studio without any sort of financing, aside from, of course, Kickstarter, which I'm sure there are backers here as well, and government funding, which is great, living in a social democracy. What I did think we succeeded at was pushing the choice consequence mechanics a lot. And I'm not going to spend time talking about that now because this is not a sort of a post-mortem of Dreamfall Chapters. What we did fail at was attempting to create social mechanics around choice consequence. And again, I don't really have time to talk about this now. But in this game, we sort of took the inspiration from Telltale and tried to find a way to evolve that whole idea of making choices and sharing those choices with the world and tying that into Facebook, unfortunately, and all kinds of social services. And it sounded like a good idea at the time, and it worked, but yeah, no one really cared. It wasn't why people wanted to play this game. So we learned that the hard way. But, we tried. But dissecting this game and going into all the details about this game, that's a whole other talk. So, if you want to talk to me about that, I'm available afterwards. I will be having drinks at the pub. So feel free to buy me a beer and I'll answer all your questions. So with like 10 minutes to spare, this is what my talk is about. This is where I started, right? This is where I 2 months ago sat down and wrote this slide and yes, this is what I'm going to be talking about. Adventure Games 1, what's next? But I have actually been talking a little bit about that already. Adventure game design deeply influences or has influenced all narrative game design. We should stop narrowly defining what adventure games are and aren't, and focus on the evolution and revolution of adventure game design. Yeah. Adventure games used to be where we got our stories back in the weird box Day of the Tentacle days. If you wanted a story, you played a point-and-click adventure game. But that stopped being the case. As adventure game design, both the narrative design and mechanical design moved and infiltrated other genres. And I saw that happening in real time. The idea of sort of the modern adventure made no sense when games suddenly had, when RPGs had branching dialogues and scripted characters, when action games had strong narratives, when, games of every type stole from the classic adventure game. Games got more sophisticated. I saw somebody write, a shift towards engaging minds, not just thumbs, as an evolution of games. And I think what's happened in the last 10 years, engaging emotions, not just thumbs and minds. And that sort of accurately describes how, I guess, adventure games won, or how the narrative won. So the definition of adventure games, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I don't have that much time, but I was just browsing through the list of adventure games on Steam and on Metacritic, and it's interesting to see what games are defined as adventure games. And first I thought oh, this is not good. But now I'm thinking why not? Why gatekeep what adventure games are? Isn't the whole idea to have some kind of unique narrative experience where you get to interact with characters and the environment and have some cerebral challenges and not just, challenges for your thumb? So I don't know. I don't know if I would define Rust as an adventure game or Ark. But, Witcher has elements that it clearly has borrowed from adventure games. Call of Cthulhu, Assassin's Creed. These are games that you wouldn't call adventure games, but they are inspired by them. They sort of hail from the same root games, I guess. So yeah, I personally believe that adventure games do not need traditional puzzles. They do not need an inventory. Adventure games are not defined by playtime or by perspective or input or controls, not by level of difficulty. And I personally believe that adventure games can have action. Our definition, or I guess my definition of an adventure game is primary focus on story and characters. Where narrative dictates game mechanics, systems are there to support the storytelling. And I guess most importantly, the player must have non-violent ways to engage and interact with other characters and the environment. Without that, I think you lost something that separates you completely from adventure games. But combat and action can be a central part of an adventure game because some genres of story require action, require peril. And we don't want to restrict the types of stories we tell with narrative games, with adventure games. There are questions here that I haven't answered, or maybe that don't have an answer. Whether or not adventure games can have no puzzles or gates or challenges whatsoever, or whether an adventure game needs to have a somewhat traditional plot structure, or if adventure game needs dialogue and words. I don't know, and I'm not going to have time to answer these questions now, but something to think about. Yeah, I mean, the most important thing to me is that adventure games need to contain peaceful, non-violent interactions. And I've been playing Red Dead Redemption lately, because of course, not loving it, but I'm liking it. And I just keep thinking, what if this world was less aggressive? That's all I can think about. I like shooting people. That's going to be taken out of context. But it enforces and encourages violence. There have been so many stories of me coming into the office the last couple of weeks and just being so frustrated with, like, right in the middle of solving a quest in Red Dead Redemption, then accidentally shooting somebody and then having to flee town with, the sheriff after me. That's annoying. And games would be so much better in general if we could choose to resolve conflicts peacefully in addition to murdering. That's a better quote than I like killing people. All right, so having said all that, that was a very quick 3 minutes on what adventure games are, and that's now the truth, right? That's the story I've told. Feel free to challenge me. I'm going to return to Red Thread Games and return to this for a brief moment. I think most creative people have to follow these steps. I think only geniuses get to skip emulation and evolution and go straight to revolution, and most of us are not geniuses. But what we want to do at Red Thread Games is to do something that feels to us revolutionary, different. It doesn't have to be an objective fact. It just has to be something that we subjectively feel is sort of the next step on the narrative games journey. Which brings me to Dragon, which is our next game. We actually have 3 games in various stages of development. Keep in mind we're like 12 people. We are ambitious. Dragon is a game that's coming out relatively soon. Svalbard is a survival role-playing game, which is still far off. And then we have the Angry game, which I'm not going to talk about here now. But maybe by this time next year, then we will be talking about it. And what we want to do is explore a range of adventure games. And I use the word, intentionally here, adventure games, even though on that list there was like a first-person exploration, there's survival RPG, and there's political mayhem. Because that's how we see our games. We don't want to make the same game over and over again. We want to evolve. and perhaps revolutionize interactive storytelling, push the boundaries of game narratives, and tell stories that matter and can make a difference, but always be making what we consider adventure games. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about what Dragon is, but very briefly, it's a first-person single-player game. It's the first of our short stories. It's a game about isolation. It's about people who are isolated, communities that are isolated. It's about loneliness. It's a character and dialogue-driven psychological mystery drama. It's a game without an inventory. It's not a puzzle-driven game, not a difficult game, but it's definitely an adventure game. I'm going to be showing the trailer, but I was told that we could switch off the Twitch stream at this point. So if I can get a confirmation about that, that would be awesome. Yeah. Okay, yes. Because this is the world premiere of this trailer, and we're not releasing it until Wednesday. So you're the first to see it, but I just don't want it to leak before then, because that sucks. What we wanted to do with this game is experiment in a different direction from Dreamfall Chapters. First person, no cutscenes, open world, an AI companion that you saw here. Her name is Lizzie. She feels real, independent, alive. A more dynamic story that happens around you, even without you. An interactive story that's not heavily reliant on systems, and an emotionally challenging experience rather than a mechanically challenging one. In this game, you play an American called Edward, who travels to Norway in the 1920s to find his missing sister, and he's accompanied by his ward, Lizzie, that you see here. And it's a story about what lies beneath both people and communities. And I'm not going to say much more than that. You can read more about it, but we don't want to spoil the story in this game. And we hope it's going to be a beautiful, poetic, sad, strange, different game, and we hope a game that pushes storytelling in the right direction, the direction we want to go. I'm going to skip this because we talked a lot about it, what makes this game an adventure game. I believe it's the things I talked about before, the things that are important to me about adventure games. So just wrapping up, this is, of course, people will always want good stories for good reasons and bad reasons. Most players want deep narratives. Interesting characters in immersive settings. And adventure games, sort of our take, and it can be the premium streaming TV to the AAA theatrical blockbusters. That's what we do, like lower budget, but more interesting stories geared towards niche audiences, stories that you don't get with the bigger games. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to just go to this and wrap it up and saying, adventure games won. Yay. But challenge is to keep evolving, keep pushing boundaries. Adventure game design has influenced all narrative game design, but we can't let it stagnate, or narrative games will not evolve. And we should stop narrowly defining what adventures are and aren't. But my definition doesn't necessarily mean that is the right one. It's just my take on it. Back in the old days, before this TV show, when I searched for Ragnar online, I could actually find myself. Search for Ragnar now. This is the guy that pops up all the time. It's super annoying. I hate that TV show. All right, I think we have like one question, or I don't know. Maybe two questions. No? Yes?
So you talked a lot about the definition of what adventure games are, and we're at a conference called Adventure X. I was just wondering if you've got a definition of what an adventure is.
Good question. No, I don't. This to me is an adventure right now. But that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think that requires a longer conversation.
I've been wondering lately whether this terminology, when we started using the term adventure games to define a specific type of game, there wasn't. The term adventure wasn't really used in the same way as it is now in games. Maybe some of that is games becoming more mainstream, and we have other mediums like novels, literature, and film where adventure means something very, very different. And maybe that's what we're seeing come in and start to permeate games and the way that people look at games. And that's why we see things like Skyrim or Call of Duty tagged as adventure on things like Steam.
I think you're right, but I think the idea of, and I guess that goes towards your question a bit too, is like going on an adventure. There weren't that many games that gave you the feeling of joining these characters on a visual journey to a new world. back in the day, but now there are so many games that do that and that have broadened sort of mechanically what they're able to do. They're not just games about murdering, they're also games about exploration and immersion and characters. So I think you're right in terms of, you know, the definition of what an adventure means is different now than it was 20 years ago. But I think the adventure game has almost lost significance because it has gained significance and because there's so much of adventure gaming in all genres. But I could be completely wrong. This is just my take on it. One more? Yes, green, up there.
You mentioned that a lot of modern games, or a lot of games generally, have taken a lot from adventure games, you know, in terms of branching dialogue and that kind of thing. What do you think that other genres now can take from contemporary adventure games?
Peaceful solutions. Being able to, like, again, like, I keep going back to, you know, I don't want to get hung up on Red Dead Redemption, but there's something that strikes me about that game that has, like, the most immersive world of any game ever, and it's broad and it's fantastic, and the characters are interesting, the dialogue is well written, and the music is beautiful, and there's so much room in that game to live the life of a cowboy, but at the end of the day, everybody's just so angry. And it's like, you know, I stopped by a camp out in the woods because there's smoke coming and there's the you know, the beautiful campfire lights. And I approached the camp and all I want to do is just sit down, have a short conversation. Nothing that gets in the way of the drama or the action of the game. But as I approach the camp, the guy or woman, whoever is there, they start shouting at me. And then they draw their gun and they start shooting. Like, and why not grant me that moment of peaceful interaction? Why not give me that? And that would heighten my experience a lot. Instead of a world that is always about peril and always about anger and always about shooting. You know, I think AAA games can learn to take those breathers to those moments of personal interaction and quiet and yeah, of non-aggression. I think that's the key learning. I don't know. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.